She thought a single slap could put Camille Brooks back in her place. But at 35,000 feet, above the clouds with nowhere to run, Heather Collins was about to learn that some people are quiet not because they are weak, but because they're trained to stay calm when everyone else falls apart. The first-class cabin of Aerosky Flight 217 went silent so fast it felt like the engines had stopped. A moment earlier, there had been the soft clink of ice in plastic cups, the rustle of newspapers, the low murmur of tired passengers settling in for the evening flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. Then Heather's hand crossed the space between them, and the sound that followed cut through the cabin like a crack of thunder. Camille Brooks sat still in seat 2, one hand resting on the armrest, the other slowly rising to her cheek. She did not shout. She did not stand. She did not give Heather the reaction the flight attendant seemed to be waiting for. She only looked up, her dark brown eyes steady, her breathing even, her face carrying the kind of control that made the silence around her grow heavier. Across the aisle, a little black girl named Maya Johnson froze with a coloring book open on her lap, her green crayon still pressed against the page. Her mother pulled her closer, but Maya kept staring at Camille as if trying to understand how someone could be treated so badly and still sit with so much dignity. Heather Collins stood over Camille in her Navy uniform, her blonde hair pinned perfectly beneath the cabin lights, her smile gone now, replaced by something colder and sharper. "You people always think rules don't apply to you," she said, low enough to sound controlled, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. A businessman in seat 3C lowered his phone. An elderly couple stopped, whispering. Somewhere behind them, a baby whimpered, sensing the change in the air. Outside the oval windows, the world was nothing but darkness and scattered clouds, the lights of Georgia already miles behind them. Inside the cabin, every passenger seemed to understand that something had crossed a line, even if no one yet had the courage to say it. Camille's cheek was warm where Heather's hand had landed, but her voice, when it finally came, was calm. "You should hope nothing happens on this plane," she said. Heather blinked, confused, then let out a small laugh without humor. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" Camille turned her gaze toward the aisle, toward the sealed cockpit door, toward the overhead panels humming softly above them. "No," she said. "It's advice." That answer unsettled Heather more than anger would have. Anger she could report, tears she could dismiss. But this quiet, this controlled stillness made the cabin feel smaller. Heather straightened her jacket and stepped back, pretending she still owned the moment. She had no idea that 23 minutes later, the captain would collapse behind that cockpit door. The co-pilot would call for help with panic in his voice, and the only person on board with the training to save the flight would be the woman Heather had just humiliated in front of everyone. For the next few minutes, no one in first class moved like they normally would on an airplane. People still breathed, still shifted in their seats, still pretended to adjust tray tables or look out the windows, but the rhythm of the cabin had changed. It had become the kind of quiet that comes after everyone sees something wrong and waits for someone else to name it first. Camille Brooks remained in seat 2A with her seat belt fastened, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned slightly toward the window. The clouds outside were pale under the moonlight, stretched across the sky like torn cotton, and for a moment she focused on them instead of the heat in her cheek, instead of the eyes fixed on her from every direction. She had learned a long time ago that humiliation was a test of breath. In a field hospital outside Kandahar, with alarms screaming and dust shaking from the ceiling, she had learned how to slow her pulse when other people lost theirs. On a transport plane over the Atlantic, with a wounded young soldier fading beneath her hands, she had learned that panic never saved anybody. So she inhaled once, slow and deep, then let the air leave her lungs without a sound. Heather Collins walked toward the galley with stiff shoulders, pretending she had simply handled a difficult passenger. She pulled the curtain halfway closed, but not before Camille saw her glance back. It was quick, almost invisible, but it was there. Not regret. Not yet. More like irritation that Camille had not fallen apart the way Heather expected. In seat 3C, Ethan Miller lowered his phone to his lap and stared at the screen. He had recorded the entire exchange. His thumb hovered over the video, unsure whether to send it, save it, or pretend he had never seen it. He was a consultant from Charlotte, the kind of man who spent most of his life in airports, and he knew airline trouble when he saw it. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something uglier dressed in polite language. Behind Camille, Maya Johnson whispered to her mother. Why did she do that? Her mother, Denise, tightened her arm around the little girl and said softly, "Sometimes people forget who they are when they think they have power." Camille heard the words, and something in her eyes softened. She turned just enough to meet Maya's gaze. The little girl looked scared, but also ashamed, as if the insult had somehow reached her too. Camille gave her the smallest smile. Not bright, not cheerful, just enough to say, "You were safe, and you did nothing wrong." That was when an older white man in seat 1D looked over the top of his reading glasses. Senator William Carter had been quiet since boarding, wearing a gray suit and the tired expression of a man who had spent too many years inside hearing rooms. He had recognized Camille the moment she stepped into the cabin, though she had not noticed him. He remembered her standing under harsh hospital lights in Germany 12 years earlier, refusing to leave an operating room until his son had a chance to live. He remembered the letter he had written afterward, the medal ceremony she skipped, the way people in uniform spoke her name with quiet respect. Now he watched her sit alone while the cabin judged its own silence, and his jaw tightened. In the forward galley, Heather whispered sharply to another attendant named Lauren Reed. "She was being difficult," Heather said. "You saw how she looked at me." Lauren did not answer right away. She was younger, with nervous hands and kind eyes, and she had seen enough to know Heather's version would not hold. "Maybe we should tell the captain," Lauren said. Heather's face hardened. "There is nothing to tell. I handled it." But just as she said that, the airplane gave a small shudder. Not enough to frighten anyone, only enough to ripple the drinks on the trays and make the overhead bins creak softly. The seatbelt sign chimed back on. Camille looked up before anyone else did. Her eyes moved to the ceiling panels, then to the aisle, then toward the cockpit door. It was not fear on her face. It was recognition, the kind that came from years of reading small changes before they became emergencies. Heather stepped out of the galley, forcing her professional smile back into place. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seat belts fastened," she announced. "We are experiencing a little rough air." Her voice was smooth, but Camille heard the tiny break beneath it. Then, from behind the cockpit door, there came a sound most passengers missed completely, a muffled thud, followed by a burst of urgent voices over the interphone. Heather froze for half a second. Camille saw it. Senator Carter saw Camille see it. And for the first time since the flight began, Heather Collins looked toward seat 2, not with contempt, but with the first shadow of uncertainty. The sound behind the cockpit door did not repeat, and that made it worse. On an airplane, normal trouble had a rhythm, a chime, a voice, a calm announcement from someone trained to make danger sound ordinary. But this was different. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next signal, and the longer it did not come, the more every small sound became sharp. The engines hummed steadily beneath the floor. A plastic cup rolled half an inch on a tray table. Somewhere in economy, someone laughed at something on a screen, unaware that first class had gone still for an entirely different reason. Heather Collins stood in the aisle with one hand resting against the galley wall, her eyes locked on the cockpit door. Her professional smile had vanished. "Lauren." Reed stepped closer to her and whispered, "Heather, what was that?" Heather swallowed, then lifted her chin as if posture alone could bring back control. "Probably a bag shifting," she said. But Camille Brooks knew the difference between luggage and a body losing balance. She had heard that sound in helicopters, in emergency rooms, in temporary medical tents where every second mattered and every hesitation had a cost. She did not move yet. Moving too soon would give Heather a reason to block her. Moving too fast would frighten Maya and half the cabin. So Camille watched. She watched Heather reach for the interphone. She watched Lauren wring her hands. She watched Senator Carter slowly remove his glasses, his eyes narrowing with the recognition that something official was about to become personal. The interphone buzzed once before Heather could press the button. She snatched it up. "Forward galley," she said, her voice polished but thin. For 3 seconds, she only listened. Then the color drained from her face. "Say that again," she whispered. Camille's fingers tightened once on the armrest. Not from fear, from readiness. Heather turned slightly away from the passengers, but the cabin was too quiet to hide the strain in her voice. "Is he conscious?" Another pause. Lauren brought one hand to her mouth. Heather's eyes flicked toward Camille, then away immediately, as if looking at her had been an accident. "I understand," Heather said. "I will make the announcement." She hung up slowly, and for one brief moment, all the authority she had worn like armor seemed too heavy for her shoulders. Senator Carter spoke first, calm but firm. "What happened?" Heather looked at him, then at the rows of passengers watching her. "Please remain seated," she said. "Everything is under control." Camille stood before the sentence finished. Her movement was quiet, steady, and it changed the temperature of the cabin. Heather turned sharply. "Sit down." Camille met her eyes. "You need a doctor." The words were not a question. Heather froze, and that tiny pause told everyone more than any announcement could have. Ethan Miller lifted his phone again, lower this time, careful not to draw. "Attention." Maya's mother pulled the child closer, but Maya leaned forward, watching Camille as if she had just seen the first page of a secret open. Heather stepped into the aisle, blocking the way. "I said sit down. We have procedures." Camille's voice stayed low. "Then follow them." Heather's jaw tightened. "You are not going anywhere near that cockpit." Senator Carter rose from seat 1D, slower than Camille, but with the weight of a man used to being heard when rooms became difficult. "Miss Collins," he said, "you should move." Heather blinked at him. "Sir, I need you to remain seated too. And I need you to listen very carefully," Carter replied. "That woman has saved lives in places where most people would not last 5 minutes." The cabin shifted. Heads turned toward Camille. Heather's eyes narrowed, caught between disbelief and the first edge of fear. "What are you talking about?" Carter looked at Camille, and his expression softened with old gratitude. "Dr. Camille Brooks treated my son after a military evacuation 12 years ago. If there's a medical emergency on this aircraft, she's exactly who you want walking through that door." The words landed harder than any shout could have. Lauren stared at Camille with sudden recognition. Ethan's phone captured Heather's face as the meaning settled over her. The woman she had humiliated was not helpless, not lost, not someone who had wandered into a seat where she did not belong. Camille Brooks had belonged in far more dangerous places than this narrow aisle, and she had walked out of them, carrying other people back to safety. Heather opened her mouth, but no defense came. From the cockpit, the interphone buzzed again, urgent and repeated. This time, Camille did not wait for permission. She stepped forward, and the aisle seemed to clear around her, as if the cabin itself understood who needed to move. Camille reached the cockpit door as the second urgent buzz faded into the ceiling. Lauren Reed hurried ahead of her with trembling hands, entered the access code, and waited for the small green light. The door opened only a few inches at first, enough for a rush of colder air and the tight voice of the co-pilot to slip into the cabin. "We need medical help now." Camille stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, cutting off the wide eyes of the passengers, Heather's stunned silence, and Maya Johnson's small face peering over her mother's arm. The cockpit was dim except for the glow of instruments spread across the panels like a city at night. Buttons blinked. Screens pulsed. The windshield showed nothing but darkness and cloud, with occasional flashes of distant lightning far ahead. Captain Robert Hayes was slumped in his seat, breathing shallowly, his skin pale under the instrument lights. The co-pilot, a younger man named Daniel Price, had one hand on the controls and the other hovering uselessly near the captain, torn between flying the airplane and helping the man beside him. "I am Dr. Camille Brooks," she said, and there was no drama in her voice, only command. "Tell me what happened." Daniel looked at her as if he had been waiting for someone to sound certain. He said he felt pressure in his chest. Then he got dizzy. "We were about to ask for a weather deviation. Autopilot is holding, but we have turbulence building north of us, and I cannot leave my seat. Camille leaned close to the captain without crowding him. Captain Hayes, can you hear me? His eyelids moved, but his response was weak. Camille checked his breathing, watched the rhythm of his chest, looked at the tension in his jaw, the faint sheen on his forehead, the way his right hand had fallen open against his leg. She had seen fear in many forms, but this was not fear. This was the body sending a warning. Lauren, Camille called without turning around. I need the emergency medical kit, oxygen, bottled water, and any passenger who has aspirin in an unopened package. Ask clearly. Do not let people shout over each other. Lauren opened the cockpit door, just enough to slip out, and the cabin heard Camille's voice for the first time in a different shape. Not quiet now. Not wounded. Focused. Precise. Heather stood frozen in the galley as Lauren rushed past her. Move, Lauren said, not harshly, but with enough urgency to break whatever spell Heather had been trapped in. Heather moved. In first class, Senator Carter remained standing near his seat, one hand braced against the seat back as the aircraft gave another gentle shudder. Ethan Miller had stopped recording for the moment. Even he seemed to understand that some moments required witness and others required silence. Maya whispered, "Is she going to help him?" Denise Johnson nodded, though her own eyes were wet. "Yes, baby. That is what people like her do." Inside the cockpit, Camille placed an oxygen mask over Captain Hayes and spoke to him as if they were in a calm room on the ground instead of several miles above it. "Captain, I need you to breathe slowly. You are not alone. Your co-pilot has the aircraft. I have you." Daniel exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. "Doctor, we may need to divert." "Then tell air traffic control exactly that," Camille said. "Declare a medical emergency. Ask for the nearest suitable airport with emergency services ready on arrival." Daniel nodded and spoke in his headset, his voice steadier because Camille's was steady. That was the thing about real authority. It did not need to push anyone down. It made everyone around it stand straighter. Lauren returned with the kit and oxygen supplies, followed by a small collection of unopened aspirin packets passed forward by passengers who only minutes earlier had sat in awkward silence. Camille opened the medical kit, checked the labels, and gave instructions one by one. Nothing wasted. No panique. No performance. In the galley, Heather watched through the narrow gap when the door opened again, and the memory of her own words came back to her with a weight that made her grip the counter. She had told Camille that rules did not apply to people like her. Now the entire aircraft was depending on Camille because the most important rule in the sky had become painfully simple. When someone knows how to save a life, you get out of the way. The cabin became a different place once Camille took control of the emergency. Fear did not disappear, but it stopped spreading. It settled into the seats, quiet and watchful, while passengers listened to the muted voices coming from the cockpit and the steady instructions. Moving through the forward galley, Lauren Reed passed supplies through the narrow opening of the cockpit door, her nervousness turning into focus because Camille gave her tasks simple enough to follow and important enough to matter. "Oxygen is secured," Lauren said. "Water is here. Aspirin packets are unopened." Camille checked each item, then looked back at Captain Hayes. "Captain, I'm going to help you sit as comfortably as possible. Keep your breathing slow. Do not try to speak unless you need to." Captain Hayes gave the smallest nod. His pride was still there, buried under pain and embarrassment, but Camille did not treat him like a problem. She treated him like a person who needed steadiness. That was why people trusted her. Not because of medals, not because of titles, not because Senator Carter had spoken her name with respect, but because in the middle of pressure, she made dignity feel possible. Co-pilot Daniel Price received clearance to divert toward Raleigh, North Carolina, and his voice came over the radio more controlled now. Aerosky 217 declaring a medical emergency, requesting priority landing. The words traveled through the headset, but their weight seemed to pass through the entire aircraft. In first class, several passengers closed their eyes. A man in row 4 clasped his hands together. Denise Johnson held Maya close while trying to keep her own face calm. Maya stared toward the front curtain, waiting for Camille to come back, as if waiting for proof that good people did not vanish after doing brave things. Heather stood in the galley, unable to find a place for herself. She reached for a drawer, then stopped, picked up a napkin, then put it down. For 11 years, she had known how to move through cabins, how to smile at complaints, how to make announcements sound effortless, how to keep passengers in their assigned roles. But now the roles had changed without asking her permission. Lauren, the younger attendant Heather had often corrected, was the one helping. Senator Carter, the passenger Heather had treated with careful politeness, was watching her with open disappointment. Ethan Miller, the businessman she had barely noticed, held evidence of the moment she wished she could erase. And Camille Brooks, the woman Heather had tried to shrink in front of everyone, was behind the cockpit door, keeping the captain stable and guiding the flight towards safety. The airplane dipped gently, beginning its turn east. The movement was smooth, but it sent a visible wave of worry through the cabin. Heather seized on the chance to sound useful. She stepped into the aisle and raised her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making a precautionary landing. Please stay seated and follow crew instructions." Her words were correct, but something in them felt hollow now. Passengers obeyed, not because they trusted Heather, but because they trusted the calm coming from the cockpit. Senator Carter looked at her and said quietly, "After we land, you and I will be speaking with the airline." Heather's mouth tightened. "Sir, this is not the time." "No," Carter said. "It was not the time when it happened either." Heather looked away. In the cockpit, Camille heard none of that. Her world had narrowed to breathing, pulse response time. She asked Captain Hayes simple questions, watched his eyes, monitored his strength, and kept Daniel focused on the approach. "You are doing well," she told the co-pilot. "Do not chase every bump. Let the aircraft fly. Trust your training." Daniel gave a strained laugh. "That sounds like something my instructor used to say." "Then your instructor was right," Camille said. For the first time since the emergency began, Daniel smiled. Only briefly, but enough to break the edge of panic. Then Captain Hayes reached weakly toward Camille's sleeve. She leaned closer. His voice was faint. "My crew," Camille answered without hesitation. "Your crew is doing their job. Your passengers are safe. Stay with me until we are on the ground." The plane descended through the clouds, and the cabin windows filled with scattered lights below, tiny and distant at first, then brighter with every minute. Raleigh was waiting beneath them, with emergency vehicles already moving into position. Heather saw the lights through the galley window and felt her stomach turn. She had thought the worst thing that could happen to her on this flight was being challenged by a passenger. Now she understood the truth. The worst thing had already happened. She had revealed who she was before the entire aircraft discovered who Camille Brooks had always been. The runway lights grew brighter through the cockpit windshield, stretching in long white lines beneath the clouds as Aerosky Flight 217 continued its descent toward Raleigh. The aircraft was steady, but the silence inside it had become almost sacred. No one complained about the delay now. No one asked about missed connections or dinner reservations or meetings waiting in Washington, D.C. Every person on board understood that the flight had changed from an inconvenience into a test, and the person meeting that test was the same woman many of them had watched sit alone with one hand against her cheek. Camille Brooks remained beside Captain Hayes, one hand near the medical kit, her attention divided between the man in the left seat and the young co-pilot guiding the aircraft down. Daniel Price kept his eyes forward, listening to air traffic control, repeating instructions, checking altitude, speed, and heading with a concentration so sharp it seemed to hold him upright. "You are lined up well," Camille said, not because she was flying the plane, but because she knew what a frightened person needed to hear when responsibility felt too heavy. "Stay with what you know, one step at a time." Daniel nodded, his voice tight but controlled. Landing gear down. A low mechanical sound moved through the cabin as the wheels lowered beneath them. Passengers looked at one another, suddenly aware of how close the ground was. Maya Johnson pressed her face gently against her mother's sleeve, not hiding exactly, just needing something familiar. Denise whispered, "Almost there." In the galley, Lauren Reed braced herself in the jump seat and watched Heather Collins across from her. Heather's face looked different now. The polished confidence had drained away, leaving behind a woman who seemed smaller than her uniform. She kept glancing toward the cockpit door, then toward Ethan Miller's phone, then toward Senator Carter, as if searching for a version of the story where she could still walk away untouched. But the cabin had seen too much. The truth had witnesses now. It had names, faces, and a recording. The final approach began with a gentle drop through a layer of cloud. The airplane trembled, then steadied. Daniel's breathing changed, faster for a moment, and Camille heard it immediately. "Daniel," she said, "do not let the weather fly the aircraft for you." He swallowed. "I have it. I know you do." Those 4 words landed inside the cockpit like a hand on the shoulder. Captain Hayes stirred faintly under the oxygen mask. Camille leaned toward him. "We're almost on the ground. Stay with the sound of my voice." Outside, the runway rushed closer, lights widening, pavement rising from darkness. The wheels touched down with a firm jolt that moved through the aircraft from nose to tail. A few passengers gasped. Then the reverse thrust roared. The plane slowed, and every face in the cabin turned forward as if waiting for permission to believe it was over. Daniel guided the aircraft along the runway until emergency vehicles appeared on both sides, red and blue lights flashing against the windows. Only when the plane came to a complete stop did the cabin release the breath it had been holding. It began with one quiet sob from somewhere in coach, then a whisper of thanks, then scattered applause that grew row by row until the sound filled the aircraft. Camille did not hear most of it. She was checking Captain Hayes again, making sure his breathing remained steady as the medical team prepared to board. Daniel removed one hand from the controls and covered his eyes for a second. "I thought I was going to lose him," he said. Camille looked at him. "You did not. You brought everyone down." He turned to her, stunned by the generosity of that answer. The cockpit door opened, and 2 airport paramedics entered with practiced urgency. Camille gave them a clear summary, every detail in order, nothing exaggerated, nothing missing. When she finally stepped back into the cabin, the applause faded into a silence deeper than before. Not uncomfortable this time. Reverent. Maya was the first to stand, though her mother quickly touched her shoulder. The little girl looked at Camille's face, then at Heather, then back at Camille. "You helped him even after she was mean to you," Maya said softly. Camille knelt just enough to meet her eyes. Doing the right thing should not depend on who was wrong first. Heather lowered her head, as if the words had been spoken directly into the part of her she could no longer protect. Outside the aircraft door, airport police, airline supervisors, and medical personnel waited on the jet bridge. The flight had landed safely, but for Heather Collins, the real descent was only beginning. The jet bridge door opened with a soft mechanical sigh, and the outside world entered the aircraft all at once. Cold air from the terminal mixed with the warm, tense air of the cabin. Paramedics moved first, guiding Captain Hayes carefully from the cockpit, while Camille walked beside them long enough to finish her report. She gave his symptoms, the timing, the oxygen support, the medication offered, the response she observed, and the exact moment Daniel Price declared the emergency. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. Every sentence sounded like a person placing stones in a straight line, so no one could pretend the path was unclear. Daniel stepped out behind her, pale but standing, and when the airport operations manager thanked him for the landing, he shook his head and looked at Camille. "Thank her too," he said. "I had the controls, but she kept the room from falling apart." The words moved through the front rows like a quiet current. Passengers who had once avoided eye contact with Camille now looked at her with open respect, and for some of them, shame. Ethan Miller stood in the aisle, his phone in one hand, his briefcase in the other. He had already saved the video in 3 places, not because he wanted attention, but because he'd spent too many years watching people with power rewrite moments that hurt people without it. Senator Carter stepped toward the airline supervisor, a woman named Patricia Monroe, who had arrived with 2 airport police officers and a tablet already open in her hand. "There was an incident before the medical emergency," Carter said. Heather Collins straightened instantly. "Senator, with respect, the passenger was non-compliant." The words sounded rehearsed, thin, and suddenly very small inside the cabin. Camille turned her head slightly, but she did not speak. She let the silence do what silence had been doing all evening. It made the truth louder. Ethan raised his phone. "I recorded it," he said. Heather's face changed so quickly that even Lauren noticed. It was not anger this time. It was calculation collapsing. Patricia Monroe looked from Ethan to Heather, then to Camille. "Dr. Brooks, are you willing to make a statement?" Camille glanced toward Maya Johnson, who was still standing beside her mother near row 2, watching every adult in the aisle as if she was learning how justice worked in real time. Camille took a slow breath. "Yes," she said, "but I want the child and her mother taken off the aircraft first. She has seen enough tonight." Denise Johnson's eyes filled with gratitude. Patricia nodded to one of the officers, who gently guided Denise and Maya toward the jet bridge. As Maya passed Camille, she whispered, "Are you going to be okay?" Camille gave her that same small, steady smile. "I already am." Only after the little girl disappeared into the terminal did Camille turn back to the airline supervisor. Heather folded her arms across her uniform, then seemed to realize how defensive it looked and dropped them. "This is being exaggerated," she said. "It was a stressful situation." Senator Carter's voice cut through the aisle, low and controlled. "The medical emergency came after. What happened before it was a choice." Lauren looked down, then lifted her eyes. Her hands trembled, but her voice was clear. "I did not see Dr. Brooks threaten anyone. I heard Heather speak to her unfairly more than once." Heather stared at her. "Lauren." The younger attendant flinched, then held her ground. "No, I should have said something sooner." That sentence changed the air again. It gave permission to the others. A man in row 4 said Heather had questioned Camille's seat without reason. The elderly woman in row 1 said Heather had treated Camille differently from the other first class passengers. Ethan played the video just long enough for Patricia and the officers to see what mattered. No one needed to watch it twice. Patricia's expression hardened into professional disappointment. "Miss Collins," she said, "you are relieved from duty pending investigation. Please collect your personal items and come with us." Heather looked at Camille then, finally without the mask. For the first time all evening, she seemed to understand that Camille did not need to destroy her. Heather had done that herself, in front of witnesses at 35,000 feet, while wearing the uniform of a company that trusted her with people's safety. Camille stepped aside to let her pass. Heather stopped, as if expecting a final insult, a victory line, something sharp enough to make her feel like the victim. Camille gave her none of that. She only said, "Stress does not create character. It reveals it." Heather's eyes dropped. The officers escorted her into the jet bridge, past the passenger she had tried to command and the woman she had tried to diminish. Outside the windows, emergency lights still flashed against the dark Raleigh runway. But inside the aircraft, the storm had finally moved from the sky into the truth, and this time, there was nowhere left for it to hide. The terminal at Raleigh had the strange stillness that airports get late at night, when the bright lights stay awake long after most people have run out of energy. Passengers from Aerosky Flight 217 stood near gate C12 in small clusters, wrapped in coats, holding carry-on bags, speaking in lowered voices as if they had just left a hospital instead of an airplane. Through the tall windows, emergency vehicles still glowed on the wet pavement beyond the jet bridge. The rain had started lightly, turning the runway lights into long red and white reflections. Camille Brooks sat near the window with a paper cup of water in her hands, untouched. The mark on her cheek had faded slightly, but not enough for people to forget. They kept glancing at her, then looking away with the awkwardness of those who had witnessed someone else's pain and were not sure whether apology could reach backward in time. Senator Carter stood a few feet away with Patricia Monroe, the airline supervisor, speaking in a voice low enough to be private, but firm enough to carry weight. "This cannot be handled as a customer service complaint," he said. "It was discrimination, misconduct, and a failure of crew judgment before a medical emergency ever began." Patricia nodded, her face pale with the burden of knowing that the company's neat statements would not be enough this time. Ethan Miller had already sent the video to airport police and the airline's incident team. He had not posted it online. Not yet. Something about Camille's restraint made him feel that the story belonged first to her, not to the noise of strangers. Lauren Reed sat alone across from the gate counter, still in uniform, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had not tasted. She looked younger now, stripped of the false confidence that Heather had always demanded from the crew around her. After several minutes, she stood and walked toward Camille. "Dr. Brooks," she said softly, "I am sorry." Camille looked up. Lauren's eyes were wet, but she did not make the apology about herself. That mattered. "I should have spoken sooner," Lauren continued. "I knew it was wrong before it got worse." Camille studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Next time, let knowing be enough reason to act." Lauren swallowed and nodded back, as if those words had been heavier than forgiveness. Near the gate desk, Denise Johnson held Maya's hand while an airline employee arranged hotel vouchers for the diverted passengers. Maya kept looking toward Camille, not with fear now, but with a kind of careful admiration. Finally, she slipped from her mother's side and approached. "Miss Camille?" she asked. Camille turned fully toward her. "Yes, sweetheart." Maya hesitated, twisting the sleeve of her pink hoodie between her fingers. "When she said those things, did it make you feel small?" The question reached Camille in a place no accusation could. She set down the water cup and leaned forward. "For a second," she said honestly, "but then I remembered something my mother taught me. Nobody can make you smaller unless you agree to shrink." Maya absorbed that with the seriousness only children can give to truth. "I do not want to shrink," she said. Camille smiled. "Then do not." Denise covered her mouth, trying not to cry. Behind them, Senator Carter had gone quiet, listening. So had Ethan. So had Patricia. For all the official reports, witness statements, and phone recordings gathered that night, this was the moment that stayed with them. Not the emergency landing. Not the flashing lights. Not Heather being escorted away. It was a little girl learning, in real time, that dignity could survive humiliation and still choose kindness. Then Patricia Monroe's tablet chimed. She read the message, and her expression changed. "Dr. Brooks," she said carefully, "our internal team has found prior passenger complaints involving Miss Collins. Several were dismissed as misunderstandings." The terminal seemed to tighten around the words. Camille did not look surprised. She only looked tired. Senator Carter's jaw set. "Then this was not a single bad moment," he said. "It was a pattern that found the wrong witness." Ethan glanced at his phone, where the video waited like a match in a dry field. Camille rose slowly, buttoned her coat, and looked out at the rain shining under the airport lights. "No," she said. "It was a pattern that finally met the truth." By the time the replacement crew arrived, the story had already moved beyond the gate at Raleigh. Not loudly at first, not as a headline, not as a viral storm, but as something quieter and stronger. A paramedic told a supervisor that the doctor from the flight had likely saved the captain from a far worse outcome. A gate agent told another gate agent that the same doctor had been mistreated before she ever stepped into the cockpit. An airport police officer filed a report that included witness statements, video evidence, and a note that several passengers described the incident as racially motivated. Truth moved that way sometimes, not like lightning, but like water finding every crack in a wall. Heather Collins sat in a private airport office with her badge on the table in front of her, staring at the floor while two airline investigators asked questions she could no longer answer with confidence. Every version she tried to build fell apart against the same simple facts. The seat was Camille's. The video was clear. The witnesses agreed. The prior complaints existed. And most damaging of all, Camille had not responded with anger. She had responded with service. That made Heather's excuses sound even smaller. Outside the office, Camille stood near the window as rain slid down the glass in silver lines. Senator Carter approached with his coat over one arm. "Washington can wait until morning," he said. "The committee will understand." Camille gave a faint smile. "I was supposed to speak about accountability in emergency systems." Carter looked toward the closed office door. "It appears the subject found you first." Camille did not laugh, but her expression softened. Across the gate area, Ethan Miller finally walked over. "Dr. Brooks," he said, holding up his phone but keeping the screen turned toward himself, I have the recording. I did not post it. I wanted to ask what you wanted done with it. Camille looked at him for a long moment. Send it to the investigators, she said. Send it to the family if they need it. But do not turn Maya's fear into entertainment. Ethan nodded slowly, and the respect in his face deepened. Understood. Near the gate counter, Maya Johnson was half asleep against her mother's side, still clutching the green crayon she had carried off the plane. Camille walked over before leaving. Denise stood as if to thank her again, but Camille gently shook her head. Some gratitude did not need to be repeated. Maya opened her eyes when Camille knelt in front of her. Are you going to fly again? The little girl asked. Camille smiled. Yes. Maya frowned. Even after tonight? Camille looked toward the dark window, where the aircraft sat under rain and emergency lights, no longer frightening, just a machine waiting to be cleaned, checked, and sent back into the sky. Especially after tonight, she said. Bad moments do not get to own good places. Maya thought about that, then nodded as if accepting a mission. Denise whispered, Thank you for what you showed her. Camille answered quietly. She already had courage. She just needed to see it standing up. At dawn, the passengers boarded a new aircraft bound for Washington, D.C. Captain Hayes was in stable condition at a Raleigh hospital. Daniel Price had given his statement. Lauren Reed had asked to be reassigned pending the investigation, not to escape responsibility, but because she said she needed to become the kind of crew member who spoke before harm happened, not after. Heather did not return to the gate. Her uniform jacket remained folded in the office, her employee identification sealed in an evidence bag beside the written complaints that should have mattered long before Flight 217 landed. When Camille stepped onto the replacement aircraft, the cabin grew quiet again, but this time the silence was different. Passengers made room. A man helped lift her bag. Senator Carter gave her the aisle with a small nod. Maya waved from 3 rows back. Camille took her seat by the window as the morning sun broke through the clouds over North Carolina. The sky ahead was gold, wide, and clean. She touched her cheek once, not because it still hurt, but because she wanted to remember the lesson clearly. Some people mistake calm for weakness. Some mistake kindness for permission. Some mistake a uniform for character. But by the time the wheels lifted off the runway,